I've watched some of Chuck Lorre's shows over the years, and there's one thing I've never been a huge fan of, and it's the way he incorporates women. This especially in 2.5 Men and in some cases The Big Bang Theory. He always seems to use the concepts of female objectification and misogyny as tools for comedy, but not in a way that feels self-critical and challenging, just in a more self-aware but ineffective way. Now, before anyone gets ironically butthurt, I'm in no way saying that Chuck Lorre and the rest of his crew are a bunch of misogynists. I'm pretty sure it's just a matter of preferential differences. All I'm saying is that it doesn't work for me, and thankfully I don't see that in young Sheldon, which is definitely a relief, but there is something else that's very present in young Sheldon, and it's also present in other Chuck Lorre shows: mother issues. In episode 8, George decided to spend more time with Sheldon and takes him and Georgie to wherever Sheldon wanted to go. During that trip, there were moments of bond between Sheldon and George, and overall, while I do have some issues with the episode, most of them brought up in part 1, it was actually a fine episode. But let's tackle the other side of the story, which was the part where Mary, Missy, and Meemaw decided to hang out as well, and it was established that Mary has unresolved issues with her mother, much like every other Chuck Lorre show. Like, I don't get why we always need a character that has mother issues, and why is it that every time the mother is neglectful? Like, what the hell, Chuck? I'm beginning to think this is a cry for help. Episode 9 arrives, and remember last video when I said that I was afraid that the following episodes would get bland? Let me rephrase that. I was actually afraid of having to repeat myself over and over again, and with this episode I'm unfortunately subject to that. My thoughts on this episode are very similar to my previous thoughts. I don't care for Georgie because he's insufferable, and it wouldn't upset me if he did fail the test. And this is just another simple episode which can only be enjoyed if you're invested in the characters and somehow the humor. And surprisingly, I'm not. You know how in my anime list the second seasons always get higher scores because the only ones who are keeping up with the show are mostly the fans that are already invested? It's the same with young Sheldon and this episode, I guess. I shouldn't have reached this far, and I'm dissatisfied with the fact that I'm still sitting through this. It's also the effect of watching a comedy series driven by silly situations every single day of the week. At the end, every episode is attempting to achieve the same goal, which is to be funny, and there are only so many times you can say that an episode isn't funny before you get tired. At some point I should have just dropped the show, because eventually the show will just enter a never-ending cycle of recycling my thoughts on the show. And for a while, I thought it would remain that way until I watched the 10th episode, and not only were my expectations subverted in terms of my thoughts on it, but it's also the first episode of young Sheldon I would consider to be good. What happened was Sheldon's high school principal recommended his parents to send Sheldon to a school for the gifted in Dallas. Right off the bat, the episode already did something right. It showed us a brief compilation of Sheldon intimidating his teachers, which offers some context to the episode when looking at it individually. But even then, it's shown throughout the series that Sheldon owns his class when it comes to intellect. So, good build up. After Mary and George were given that offer, they kept discussing whether or not it's right for Sheldon, until they eventually decided to ask Sheldon if he wanted to go, and he said yes. Something this episode succeeds that the 4th episode doesn't is that it has slightly more unpredictability. In the 4th episode, since I already knew that it would take 5 more years for George to die, it was hard for me to feel any tension. But with this episode, I had no idea. I mean, I know Sheldon will enter college once he reaches the age of 11, but during the period before that, I had no idea where he studied. I don't have any information regarding whether or not he has ever entered a school for gifted youngsters, so I couldn't fully predict the outcome. Actually, I was kind of hoping for him to leave because it would set up a new dynamic between the main cast, which would definitely tease my interest since the previous dynamic was just not working for me that much. But unfortunately, he ended up returning, which I'm not gonna be too mad because it was a nice conclusion for the episode's narrative, even if I personally thought it would be much more exciting if they mixed things up. Oh, and I have to mention how successful the episode was at firing up emotions. Out of all of the main cast, George and Mary are most likely my favorites. I've already expressed how I'm mildly fond of George's personality, and I appreciate Mary's care and concern for Sheldon. Not to mention, she's by far the best actress. So seeing them coping with the idea of Sheldon leaving and the ongoing discussions between them was definitely emotionally investing to watch. I would recommend watching this episode, but at the same time, I don't think you'll get the same emotional reaction if you haven't watched the previous episodes. For instance, there's a scene where Missy asks Sheldon whether or not he would miss her, and she started off the conversation by asking if he was still asleep, and she did the same thing even after he was gone. This was a reference to previous interactions she had with Sheldon in previous episodes, so the only way you would feel the full impact of the scene and others is if you watch all of the 9 episodes that came before that, and there's no way in hell I'll recommend any of the previous junk. So the best thing I can say is that if you've seen at least some of young Sheldon, you should watch this episode as well. Now that we're on a stream of positivity, let's talk about episode 11. Now, I've always had conflicting feelings over the way Mary Cooper is characterized. In my review of the pilot, I mentioned how in The Big Bang Theory, she was basically a cartoon character, and that's true. Try watching the witness revelation, then look at me in the eye and say that she behaves realistically. In young Sheldon, I feel like she's a lot more grounded and rational, and I think she's better like this. However, I always wonder how will the show succeed at transitioning from this version of Mary to this, because it would basically mean that she regressed as a character over the years, and this also applies to Sheldon. I also noticed that in this show, he's less directly condescending, has more or less the same sense of morality, and has pretty much the same level of emotional maturity. In fact, I would even argue that he has more. So much like Mary, for Sheldon to become what he was in the beginning of The Big Bang Theory, he would have to regress as a character, and I do question whether or not the show will be able to pull that off in a consistent way. However, in this episode, we begin to spot traces of Big Bang Theory's Mary, as she loses it over seeing Sheldon playing with demonic figurines in a freaking board game, and as a result, she tells Sheldon to attend Sunday school. But there's one thing I don't get. Sheldon has been an open atheist since at least the beginning of the series. I don't get why she suddenly thought that this was the time to send Sheldon to Sunday school. Like, I think I'm missing something? Regardless, I do think that this is one of the better episodes because unlike all of the episodes, including the previous one which was my favorite, this one actually made me laugh, surprisingly. Now, don't get me wrong, for the most part, the humor was just as poor as the previous episodes, but there were moments that at least succeeded in making me laugh. The invisibility cloak joke made me laugh, and I thought it was funny when Sheldon decided to create his own religion, which is mythology, and the only sin is being stupid. So yeah, congratulations young Sheldon, you are actually funny. Also, while I don't think I would recommend watching this episode, I wouldn't convince others not to watch it because it had a fun concept. Good lord, I can't believe I'm associating the word fun with young Sheldon. The 12th episode's conflict was weirdly established. Sheldon wanted a computer, but George couldn't afford it, and Mary decided that she would use her own savings to buy the computer. Now, here's where things get confusing. George made it clear that he was upset at the fact that he shares his money with Mary, and yet she kept her savings not only to herself but also a secret. This eventually led George doing something stupid out of spite, which led Mary to move away from the house temporarily because she was upset, which is reasonable. But for some reason, she told Meemaw that she was upset at the fact that George was angry and scared of the idea of her being financially independent. Except that was not at all the reason why he was mad. He made it very clear what was his beef the night before the separation. Now don't get me wrong, what she's saying is probably true, and if it is true, George is in the wrong, but the episode never indicated that it was the case. There was no build up in previous episodes, so I have no idea where she got that idea. If I had to evaluate the situation based on what was presented, I am not on her side. She did keep a secret from him, and she's making wild accusations with no base. But somehow at the end of the day, George had to apologize. This apology could have been much better executed. George never even had to reflect on what was really making her mad. He just did it because I guess he kind of had to. Like, they're not gonna stay separated forever, and I guess one of them had to eventually apologize so they can finally talk, but at the same time, this beef between them was poorly resolved. As for the rest of the episode, I'm gonna use a word that I hate when others use it to describe cartoons. It was harmless. Nothing infuriating, nothing horrible, just harmless viewing. And this pretty much applies to the 3 episodes that came after this. Although I can only speak for myself specifically. I watched 11 episodes before reaching here, so as a result, I'm accustomed to the show's environment. Not to mention, I didn't watch these episodes weekly, I instead binge watched them, so everything about the show, like the characters, the style, and the locations, are freshly embedded in my subconscious. Which partially makes me angry because I wish I had embedded something else that I actually like, but it also makes me go soft on the settings because of how familiar they are. And hell, not even just young Sheldon, I've known Sheldon Cooper's character for years. I'm very familiar with him, so when I see him freaking out over germs to the point where he creates a closed ecological system for him in the garage, my reaction is, yep, that's the Sheldon I know. Now, I don't want to underpraise the showrunners. The fact that there weren't any significant flaws that were major turnoffs besides the amateur performances and lackluster humor, it proves that these episodes had less fuck-ups, which is something that deserves to be celebrated. Not to mention, unlike a lot of the previous episodes, the premises were manageable enough to hold my attention. Now, does that mean that I like the show? No. I have a long list of shows that I've watched, currently watching, and about to watch that offer or will likely offer me stronger emotions than young Sheldon. And keep in mind, I have not changed my mind about any of the trash that I mentioned in my previous video. But even if in general I thought this series was fine, that's still not enough. I don't want stuff that are fine. There's so much fine content that I can find and wastefully digest, but I don't want that. I want good and above good. But despite that, I'm gonna continue watching young Sheldon. There are still 7 episodes left and I have to review them. Why? Because I started it to begin with, so I might as well finish it. Who knows, maybe by the time I upload part 3, it will become good. Then again, I was told that the pilot was good.